All right, welcome back, deep thinkers. You know we love to wrestle with the big questions here, and today we're diving into one that's been a philosophical battleground for centuries, the relationship between science and religion. It's a debate that just keeps going, right? And it shapes how we understand, well, everything, from the tiniest little particles to the whole vast universe.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've got a powerful source to guide us. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a fantastic entry on religion and science. It's a super comprehensive and rigorously academic overview of the whole philosophical landscape.
Exactly. And we're going to use it to map out all those key perspectives and those points where things get a little, well, contentious. It's tricky territory. So in this episode, we really want to get inside the minds of philosophers, right? How do they think about this whole relationship between religion and science? What are their core perspectives, those subtle nuances, and those really fundamental assumptions? You'll see that the encyclopedia takes a really broad view, drawing on different religious traditions and different historical periods. It gives us a whole bunch of lenses to analyze this really complex interaction. I mean, where do we even begin?
Well, a philosopher would probably start by asking, hold on, what do we even mean by science and religion?
Right, like, are those even the right words?
Exactly. The encyclopedia makes a really important point. These aren't fixed universal categories. The way we understand religion today, this big, broad term for all these different global systems of belief and practice, well, that's relatively new. It mostly emerged in the 19th century with those early anthropologists.
Huh, that's interesting. So before that,
Someone like Aquinas, for example, he used religio in a much narrower way, more like piety or specific devotional practices within a particular, like, orthodox framework.
right, right. So the way we even think about religion as something separate from other parts of life is itself like a historical thing.
Exactly.
And it's kind of the same with science, right? It wasn't always called that.
Nope. It used to be natural philosophy or experimental philosophy. The term scientist becoming a thing, well, that was a 19th century development, reflecting this whole shift in thinking.
So right from the get-go, a philosophical lens shows us we're dealing with these concepts that have their own baggage, right? Their meanings have changed a lot over time.
Absolutely. And one key philosophical distinction that comes up when we try to understand the line between science and religion is this thing called methodological naturalism.
Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. What's really interesting for a philosopher is that methodological naturalism, which is like a guiding principle for so much of modern science, doesn't actually say anything about whether the supernatural exists or not.
This is not saying there's no God or anything like that.
Not necessarily, no. It's more about how science works. It says that scientific investigation has to stick to natural things and the laws that govern them. Supernatural stuff, even if some religions believe in it, well, that's outside the scope of what science can explain or predict.
Ah, so it's about the method, the approach, not about denying the supernatural outright.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a subtle but really important difference for philosophical analysis. It's different from ontological naturalism, right? The kind that says there's nothing beyond the natural world.
You got it.
And that whole Kitzmiller v. Dover trial, the one the encyclopedia mentions, that's a great example of this distinction playing out in the real world, right? With intelligent design and whether it can be considered science because it brings in supernatural agency.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And building on this idea of defining our terms, Ian Barber's fourfold taxonomy, it's a really useful framework for a philosopher trying to categorize how science and religion relate to each other. He came up with four models: conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration.
Okay, let's unpack those. The conflict model, that's the classic one, right? Science and religion are always at odds, fighting for truth and authority.
Yeah, and the examples people often use, like Galileo and the initial reactions to Darwin, they paint this picture of inevitable clashes.
Like they just can't get along.
But a philosopher would dig deeper, and they'd see that the warfare thesis, this idea of constant, absolute conflict, well, it's been challenged by historians and philosophers of science.
Oh, really? So it's not that simple.
Not at all. Our source points out that this model has its own history, often tied to particular agendas, like liberal Protestants trying to separate spheres of influence.
Interesting. So the conflict model itself is like a product of its time and certain perspectives.
Yeah. And someone like Alvin Plantinga, he argues that the real conflict isn't necessarily between science and religion, but between science and philosophical naturalism. That worldview that goes beyond scientific findings to deny anything supernatural.
Okay, so that's a really interesting twist. The tension might not be with the scientific discoveries themselves, but with the philosophical interpretations that get layered on top.
Right.
All right, what about the independence model? I feel like I've heard of that one.
Yeah, that's Stephen Jay Gould's Noma non-overlapping magisteria.
Ah, okay, that rings a bell. What's the idea there?
Gould said that science and religion are totally separate. They ask different questions and have different areas of authority. Science is all about the empirical stuff, like how the heavens go,
Yeah.
while religion is about values, meaning purpose, like how to go to heaven.
Okay, so each one stays in its own lane, and there's no conflict.
Right. But for a philosopher, this strict separation raises some problems. The encyclopedia points out that many religions actually make claims that sound empirical, like factual statements about historical events, the nature of the cosmos, even the effectiveness of certain practices.
Yeah, if religion is only about values, then what grounds those values? Where do they come from? That's a big philosophical question.
Exactly. And that leads us to the dialogue model, which suggests a more interactive relationship.
Okay, so they can talk to each other.
Yeah, they might have different methods and focus, but there can be points of contact where they can learn from each other. For example, both science and religion operate on certain assumptions, like the intelligibility of the universe. That could be a shared starting point.
Yeah, if the universe were totally random and unpredictable, science wouldn't work, would it?
Nope.
And that's interesting from a theological perspective, too. The Christian idea of creation, a rational God creating an ordered universe, well, that could be seen as a foundation for the possibility of scientific discovery.
For sure. And because it's a contingent creation freely made by God, we need empirical observation to figure out how it works. We can't just reason it out beforehand.
Well, that's cool. So the very act of creation could be seen as setting the stage for science.
Right. And Barber also said that both science and theology use models, metaphors, analogies to try and understand complex things.
Like they both have to simplify things to make sense of them.
Exactly. Alistair McGrath's idea of partially overlapping magisteria POME, it's a more nuanced take on this. It acknowledges that science and religion have different methods, but there can be areas where their interests and even their findings overlap.
Okay, so there's room for some crossover, some shared territory.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, what about the integration model?
That one's all about trying to unify science and religion into one big coherent worldview. Barber identified three main types of integration: natural theology, theology of nature, and process philosophy.
Let's break those down.
Natural theology tries to use scientific findings to argue for God's existence or attributes, like those cosmological arguments based on the Big Bang or fine-tuning arguments from physics. Theology of nature starts with a religious framework and sees how it can inform or even challenge scientific understandings.
And process philosophy.
That one draws a lot from Alfred North Whitehead. It tries to combine fundamental concepts from both science and religion into a single, unified system.
So it's like building a whole new philosophical system that incorporates both.
Yeah, that's the goal. But the encyclopedia rightly points out that these integration approaches, while they might sound appealing, often run into problems.
Like what?
Well, like Teilhard de Chardin's attempts to integrate evolution with Christian theology, they caused a lot of controversy. And integration models tend to focus on theistic views, so it's hard to fit in non-theistic religions.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to integrate something that doesn't have a concept of God in the first place.
Exactly. And even within Christianity, figures like Frederick Tennant, who tried to explain sin through evolution, show how integration can lead to conflict with traditional doctrine.
Right, so it's not always a smooth process.
Nope.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, the encyclopedia also talks about the scientific study of religion.
Yeah, that's where we use science to understand religion itself, like its nature, origins, how it works.
So studying religion like it's a natural phenomenon.
Exactly. And what's interesting for a philosopher is the assumption there that religion, like anything else in human behavior and culture, can be explained through natural causes.
Right, no need to invoke the supernatural to understand it.
This approach goes back to those natural histories of religion in the 17th and 18th centuries. People like David Hume were trying to find natural explanations for religious beliefs, often focusing on things like fear or ignorance.
And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, the social sciences got involved.
Yeah, anthropology, sociology, psychology, they all contributed. Like Auguste Comte's idea that societies progress through stages, from theological to metaphysical to positive, which was his word for scientific.
Ah, so religion was seen as a kind of primitive stage that we would eventually go out of.
That was his view, yeah.
And in anthropology, we had cultural evolutionism trying to explain the development of religious beliefs across different cultures.
Right, and functionalism, like Emile Durkheim, saw religion as having social functions, bringing people together.
Like social blue.
Exactly. And psychologists like Freud and William James offered their own natural explanations, focusing on unconscious drives and subjective experience.
So lots of different angles, but all looking at religion through a scientific lens.
Right. But over time, people started to criticize these grand theories.
Like too simplistic, not taking into account the actual diversity of religions.
Yeah, so the focus shifted to more specific studies of particular traditions. And more recently, we've seen the rise of the cognitive science of religion, CSR.
What's that all about?
It's really interesting. The core idea is that religious beliefs aren't just cultural things, they also come from the way our brains work, our basic cognitive processes.
Oh, so like hardwired into us.
In a way, yes. And CSR explores how our innate biases and abilities might lead us to religious belief.
Cool. What kind of biases?
Well, there are byproduct theories, like Paul Bloom's argument that religion is a byproduct of our ability to see the difference between minds and bodies, leading to belief in souls and spirits and stuff.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you can think about a mind separate from a body, then it's not a big leap to think about a mind existing without a body.
Right. And there are adaptive theories, too, which say that some religious beliefs, especially belief in moralizing big gods, helped early humans survive by making them cooperate more.
So religion as a survival strategy.
In a way, yeah. But that connection between big gods and large-scale societies is still being debated.
It's all very complex.
Yeah,
But it shows how science is trying to understand religion from multiple angles.
absolutely.
Okay, so we've looked at these models, and now let's get into how this whole science and religion thing plays out in different religious traditions. The encyclopedia focuses a lot on Christianity, but a broader view is important, right?
Absolutely. For a philosopher, comparing different worldviews is key.
So starting with Christianity, there's this two books metaphor. The idea that God reveals himself through the book of nature, the created world, and the book of scripture, the Bible.
Yeah, and thinkers like Augustine and Bonaventure, they really wrestled with how to interpret these two books and how they relate.
What did they say?
Well, Augustine tended to see the book of nature as more accessible to everyone, while Bonaventure emphasized the need for scripture to understand nature correctly, maybe because of the effects of original sin on our reason.
So is nature enough, or do we need the Bible to guide us?
That tension is still around today. And you have approaches like concordism trying to match up specific Bible passages with scientific findings.
But that can be tricky, right? Some parts of the Bible don't seem to line up with modern science.
Exactly. Scholars like Denis Lamoureux point out that it's hard to reconcile those inaccuracies with the idea that the Bible is inerrant, that it's never wrong.
So what are some other ways Christians approach this?
Well, some use broader frameworks like the Wesleyan quadrilateral. It considers scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, including scientific knowledge, as sources of understanding.
So it's more about weaving together different sources.
Yeah, and integration models, where science is interpreted through theology, have been really popular in Christian discussions.
Okay, so science informs theology, but theology also shapes how science is understood.
Right, and a lot of this dialogue is based on critical realism. It's this philosophical idea that tries to find a middle ground between thinking our perceptions are perfect reflections of reality and thinking that science is just a bunch of useful tools.
So it's about being critical of both our observations and our interpretations.
Exactly. And there's also this historical argument that Christianity itself might have helped the rise of Western science.
Oh, really? How so?
Peter Harrison talks about the doctrine of original sin. He says that the fall led to a belief that human reason is flawed, so people had to rely more on observation and experimentation.
Huh. So our limitations actually pushed us toward science.
That's the argument. And the
Yeah.
condemnation of Paris in 1277, which opened up space for thinking beyond Aristotle, that might have helped too.
But we have to be careful not to give all the credit to Christianity, right?
For sure. Other cultures, like Islamic and Greek scholarship and technological innovations, they all played a part.
And there are still tensions within Christianity, especially around evolution.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on to Islam. The encyclopedia talks about this amazing period of scientific flourishing in the Islamic world, from the 9th to the 15th centuries.
Yeah, they made huge advances in math, astronomy, medicine. People call it Arabic science, but science in the Islamic world is more accurate.
Right. It wasn't just Arab scholars involved.
Exactly. And the Abbot Caliphate in Baghdad supported this intellectual growth. They set up institutions like the House of Wisdom, which translated texts from Greek and other languages, and Arabic being a common language helped spread these ideas.
So it was this huge intellectual network.
Yeah. But then scientific output declined, while other intellectual pursuits continued.
Why was that?
There are a lot of theories. Some say it was the rise of more conservative theology. Others say it was the influence of legal orthodoxy. It's complex.
And in the modern era, Western colonialism and its association with science created more tension.
For sure. But there are Muslim scientists today working to reconcile science and religion, emphasizing the harmony between the Quran and scientific discoveries.
Like who?
Like Nidhal Gesum and Rana Dajani, they often point to Ibn Rushd, who argued there's no fundamental conflict between God's word and God's work.
Okay, so there's a push for a more harmonious view.
Yeah, and while old Earth creationism is more common in Islam than young Earth creationism, the special creation of Adam is still a widespread belief, although some Muslim scientists do support evolution.
It's a mixed bag, like in many religions. What about Hinduism?
Hinduism is so diverse, and there's not such a strict separation between the divine and creation like in the Abrahamic religions. Ancient Vedic rituals, with their focus on astronomy and linguistics, actually encouraged early scientific thinking.
Oh, wow. So rituals as drivers of scientific inquiry.
Yeah, they needed to figure out things like precise timings and constructions.
Practical needs leading to intellectual breakthroughs.
And there were heterodox schools, like the Carvaka school, that rejected supernaturalism altogether.
So a naturalistic philosophy within Hinduism.
Exactly. And natural theology has a long history, too, especially in the Advaita Vedanta school, with thinkers like Shankara arguing for a creator based on the order of the universe.
Okay, so they saw design in the world as evidence for God.
Yeah. And British colonialism in India led to different responses. Some revived the idea of an ancient Vedic science, while others integrated evolution, like Sri Aurobindo.
So adapting to the challenges of modernity in different ways.
And it's interesting how some Indian scientists were quiet about religion, while others, like Ramanujan and Bose, explicitly linked their science with their spirituality.
Different approaches to this complex relationship.
Definitely.
All right, what about Buddhism?
Buddhism is often seen as compatible with science because it doesn't have a creator god or a permanent soul.
Right, that makes it easier to fit with ideas like evolution.
Yeah, and the Dalai Lama's dialogues with scientists have become famous. But if we look at the reception of evolution in East Asia, it's more nuanced.
So how do they react?
Well, with Western colonialism and its link to science, some Buddhists were hesitant about Darwin's emphasis on the struggle for existence. They felt it clashed with compassion and nonviolence.
So they saw a moral conflict with that aspect of the theory.
Exactly. And they were more open to alternatives like Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid. People like Honda Nisho even talked about retrogression and evolution and criticized social Darwinism.
So they weren't just accepting Western science passively. They were engaging with it, critiquing it, adapting it.
Right, they were active interpreters, not just recipients.
Finally, let's talk about Judaism.
Judaism has this strong tradition of textual interpretation, where the focus is on nuance and context, not always literal readings. That's created more space for accepting science.
So there's more flexibility in how Scripture is understood.
Yeah, and the political liberalism of many non-Orthodox Jews in the U.S. probably plays a role too. And Jewish thinkers have contributed a lot to the dialogue. Well, Herman Cohen had this neo-Kantian view that saw science, ethics, and Judaism as complementary, each addressing different aspects of knowledge.
So they're not competing, they're collaborating.
In a way, yes. And in the 20th century, there were a lot of different views, from Rabbi Cook's idea of separate domains to Kaplan's emphasis on dialogue and process theology's integrationist approach. Reform Judaism is very anti-conflict, and of course secular Jewish scientists have contributed hugely to science in general.
So there's a whole spectrum of views within Judaism, just like in other traditions.
Absolutely.
Wow, this tour through different religions really shows how complex this whole thing is. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to how science and religion relate.
It's a multifaceted tapestry shaped by history, culture, theology. For a philosopher, understanding those nuances is key.
Okay. Let's shift gears again and look at some specific topics that are hot debates right now, especially divine action and creation and the philosophical implications of human origins.
Yeah, those are where the rubber really meets the road.
Starting with divine action in creation, the encyclopedia outlines the traditional Christian doctrine. Creation ex nihilo, from nothing. Creation depending on God, God being separate from creation being inherently good, and God actively involved in the world.
And theologians distinguish between general divine action, like God sustaining the universe and its laws, and special divine action, like miracles and revelations.
Okay, so the everyday stuff versus the extraordinary.
Right. And within special divine action, there's a further distinction between direct acts, where God intervenes directly, and indirect acts, where God works through natural processes.
Like a subtle hand guiding things.
Yeah. And the big philosophical questions are, how does all this fit with our scientific understanding of a law-governed universe? And how can we make sense of these concepts in a scientific framework?
Right, if everything happens according to natural laws, where's the room for God to act?
It's a tough question, and it's important to note that the doctrine of creation itself doesn't say how old the universe is or how it was created.
So there's room for different interpretations.
Exactly. And the Big Bang, proposed by a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre, is often seen as compatible with creation ex nihilo.
Oh, that's interesting. So the science might actually support the theological idea.
Some people think so. But the success of modern science in explaining things naturally did create challenges. The idea of fixed natural laws seems to leave little room for divine intervention.
Yeah, like God's hands are tied by the laws of physics.
In a way, yeah. So philosophers have tried to reconcile these views. The encyclopedia presents a divine action spectrum. It ranges from creationism, both young Earth and old Earth, and intelligent design, which all say God intervenes directly in creation, to theistic evolution, where God works through evolution.
So different levels of God's involvement, from hands-on to more hands-off.
And then there's deism, where God created the universe but doesn't interfere anymore, and ontological materialism, which rejects divine action altogether.
So a whole range of philosophical positions.
Yeah, each with its own views on God, the universe, and their relationship.
What about miracles? How do philosophers make sense of those?
The traditional view is that miracles violate natural laws. But that's been criticized, especially by David Hume, who questioned whether we can even know if a miracle happened.
Like, how do we distinguish a miracle from something we just don't understand yet?
Right. So non-interventionist approaches have emerged, trying to understand divine action without breaking natural laws.
Like God working through the gaps in our knowledge.
Maybe. Or through the inherent uncertainty in some scientific theories.
It's all very subtle.
For sure. And historically, the mechanistic worldview of 17th and 18th century physics played a big role. The design argument, like William Paley's watchmaker analogy, was popular.
But then along came people like Laplace, who imagined a universe running on its own with no need for God to intervene.
Right. Though even Newton thought God sometimes needed to step in to keep things stable.
And 20th century physics, like relativity, chaos theory, quantum mechanics, have been used to reinterpret divine action.
Yeah, John Polkinghorne explored how chaos theory suggests an openness in natural systems, while others looked at quantum indeterminacy as a way for God to influence things without breaking physical laws.
So finding ways for God to act within the framework of modern physics.
Exactly. But these models have also been criticized for just plugging God into the gaps in our knowledge.
Like, we don't understand this, therefore God.
Right. And then there's the role of randomness in evolution.
Does randomness mean there's no purpose, no design?
That's a big debate. Plantinga says God could be guiding mutations or selecting outcomes, even if the process is random. Others see randomness as a real feature of evolution, which raises questions about divine providence.
How can God have a plan if things happen by chance?
Right. And theodicies, like the free will theodicy and the only way theodicy, try to explain how randomness, even suffering, could be part of God's plan.
So finding meaning in a seemingly random world. Okay, last but not least, human origins. Genesis talks about humans being created in God's image, the fall, original sin. All that's been challenged by our understanding of evolution.
Absolutely. The idea of humans as a special creation was already being questioned before Darwin by early evolutionists.
The idea was in the air.
Yeah. And Darwin and Huxley, along with all the fossil and genetic evidence, showed that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, sharing ancestry with other primates.
So we're part of a much bigger story.
Right. And this has forced theologians to rethink things like human uniqueness and the Imago Dei, the image of God.
Do we still have a special status?
Some say the Imago Dei isn't limited to humans, that other creatures might share aspects of it. Others are trying to figure out the theological status of extinct hominins.
Like were Neanderthals made in God's image too?
It's a fascinating question, and the incarnation, the idea of Jesus being both God and human, is also being re-examined. Some see Christ as the culmination of evolution, while others focus on his role as divine wisdom in an evolving world.
So how does Jesus fit into this evolutionary picture?
It's a big theological challenge, and original sin and the fall are being debated too. Some try to reconcile them with evolution, while others see them more metaphorically.
Right. Does the fall have to be a literal event?
That's the question.
Wow, this has been a whirlwind tour of the science and religion landscape. It's so much more than just two sides clashing.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic, multifaceted dialogue with different interpretations across religions and throughout history. For a philosopher, understanding these nuances is crucial.
It's all about asking the right questions, right?
Exactly. So to our listeners, what do you think? After hearing all these different perspectives, what's the most philosophically coherent and fruitful way to understand this interaction between science and our deepest questions about meaning and purpose?
And given that both science and religion are always evolving, how might future developments change the whole conversation?
Big questions to ponder.
We encourage you to keep exploring. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and all the thinkers we've mentioned offer tons of resources. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep thinking deeply.